The short story Interpretive Maladies by Jupa Lahiri explores the theme of contrasting culture between a middle-aged Indian tour guide and a young Indian-American family. This transcontinental gap, in turn, interplays with the theme of communication gap amongst the characters. Lahiri develops the characters by employing a third-person limited point of view, that of the protagonist, Mr. Kapasi, the tour guide. This allows the audience to perceive the Das family through the eyes of a traditional Indian native man. Early in their interactions, Mr. Kapasi discerns the dysfunction of the family unit. The couple are openly hostile to one another, as they bicker about their parental responsibilities, as teenagers would squabble over chores. Neither parent displays any sign of nurture. Mrs. Das does not hold her young daughter's hand, while Mr. Das tells his son Bobby to oversee the safety of his brother Ronnie, rather than doing so himself. As a consequence, the children are disrespectful and undisciplined. Bobby outrightly defies his father's instructions, as Tina plays with the car locks which Mr. Kapasi has taken special care to secure. This family are as foreign to him as the elderly Scottish couple, to whom he was assigned the day before. This cultural discord inevitably yields mixed communication as the plot unfolds. Lahiri manages to incorporate this theme throughout by integrating symbolism, imagery, and irony. Mr. Kapasi's observations of the Das family present a lack of harmony between them. He cannot fathom the indifference in which Mr. Das holds of the world around him. Mr. Das is constantly engrossed with his camera, a symbol of his inability to see his surroundings and a true state of his family life. Rather than genuinely appreciating the splendor of the ancient monuments and its heritage, he is consumed with snapping photographs in hopes of capturing the perfect image. Through the camera lens, he ignores the blatant signs of the shattered state of his family. The reader envisions Mrs. Das donning dark sunglasses, as this is alluded to in several instances. This deliberate technique of Lahiri denotes the significance of the sunglasses. They symbolize Mrs. Das's exclusion of Mr. Kapasi, her isolation from her family, and her concealment of her secret. When she first takes interest in Mr. Kapasi and remarks on his job as an interpreter being romantic, she lifts her pinkish-brown sunglasses and arranges them on top of her head like a tiara, representing the lifting of a barrier between the two. This minor gesture from a stranger triggers emotions in Mr. Kapasi which he had long ago repressed. This sudden attention draws his own attention to how his life has become a series of compromises. He routinely endures silence from a wife who resents him. He performs a mundane and thankless occupation, and he has given up all hope of a life of significance. The very word romantic leads him to misconstrue Mrs. Das's interest. When she asks him to rewrite his address in order to send a picture of him, the scrap of paper on which he prints clear, careful letters becomes a lifeline between them. It becomes his salvation. The imagery of the Sun Temple at Konarak is a metaphor of both broken marriages. The once vibrant flowing river is now like a desert. The celebrated temple had filled with rubble years ago. Mr. Kapasi compares their failed marriages to find common ground between himself and Mrs. Das. He begins to fabricate a fantasy in which their friendship will flourish, desperately grasping the unrealistic notion that all would be right with this world again. The illusion of the future comes to a halt when Mrs. Das unexpectedly and nonchalantly confides to him of her infidelity to her husband. The gap between this foreigner and himself reappears before his eyes, a gap that is too far to bridge. He realizes that although they both suffer from a loveless marriage, their situations differ vastly. She is merely a bored, modern wife and mother who has fallen out of love with life, while he is a man bound to his ill fate by a sense of tradition and duty. When he questions Mrs. Das about the reason she shares her secret with him, in an outrage she shouts, "Stop calling me Mrs. Das! I'm 28, you probably have children my age." Mr. Kapasi is wounded to learn that he had misinterpreted the type of relationship that Mrs. Das sought from him. When he fails to offer Mrs. Das sympathy, she opens her mouth to utter her indignation, but stops herself. As he meets her glare, Mr. Kapasi is crushed. To realize that Mrs. Das does not even find him worthy of another wasted breath. She had not sought a relationship with him, of any type, at all. What Mrs. Das wanted from him was an avenue to unburden herself of her guilt. The irony revealed in the story's conclusion is that although Mrs. Das knows Mr. Kapasi is an interpreter of languages, she still desperately wants him to interpret her emotions in order to absolve her wrongdoing. Jupa Lahiri's employment of various literary devices supports the delivery of the themes of cultural as well as communication gap. Her strategy of the limited first-person viewpoint clearly illustrates the extent of both.